Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is a special live episode of Dispatches. As we approach the 2 month mark of Israel's war on Gaza, the aggression is accelerating in unimaginable ways, with Israel's genocidal drive becoming ever more apparent, while U.S. officials struggle to cover up for war crime after war crime. In the midst of all the horrors, Israel has gone to great lengths to justify its atrocities and portray its battles with Hamas as successful, using some of the laziest and most easily debunked propaganda in modern history. Why is Israeli propaganda so bad this time around? Has it always been this sloppy? Is Hamas really being eradicated as the Israelis claim? Can Israel even achieve its stated military objectives? How far is the US willing to go with its glaring double standards and embarrassing hypocrisy to back this genocide? And as Israel weaponizes anti Semitism against all of its critics, what is the actual historical relationship between Zionism and anti Semitism? To navigate all of this and more, I'm joined by Mouin Rabbani, co editor of Jadalia. Mouin, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. You've been amazing with your Twitter threads. And of course, I've been reading your
Thank you.
articles since long before October 7th. So it's an honor to have you on and to be able to share your perspective with
Thank
our
you.
audience. And I think a good place to start is, with all of the horrors we've seen coming out of Gaza, and they're getting worse. There's also this tsunami of propaganda from the Israelis about their impending victory. So it's easy to feel like the Israelis are about to win, about to take all of Gaza, like game over. But you recently tweeted in one of your many very cool threads. I'm just going to go ahead and quote you. You said, I love this. You said, it requires zero knowledge of military affairs to conclude that Israel's proclaimed objectives of eradicating Hamas are unattainable. So, I apologize. My electricity will come right back on. I'm talking to you from Lebanon. This is just what happens. But, and there goes the generator. But anyways, it has to make an appearance every show, the electricity. But I guess my question for you is, can you elaborate on that a bit? That the fact that, you're saying it requires zero knowledge of military affairs to recognize that Israel's proclaimed these military objectives that seem quite unachievable. And then what does that mean moving forward?
Well, I think there are various ways that one can reach those conclusions. One way would be to look at what Israeli and US leaders have said and what they've done. If you go to the very outset of this crisis on October 7th, in an immediate response to the Hamas attacks of that day, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, US President Joe Biden, joined by many European leaders, made clear that the objective of this war was to eradicate Hamas and that there would be no negotiations with the organization until that goal is achieved. Once Israel's onslaught on the Gaza Strip commenced, they additionally made clear that there would be no ceasefire, there would be no truce. Well, what did we see last week? Israel and the US concluded an agreement with Hamas, and specifically with Yahya Sinwar, indirectly reached through Qatar and Egypt, but nevertheless, Sinwar being the architect of the October 7th attacks. And they made an agreement with him that included a truce and an exchange of captives. Because the other point, of course, was that at the outset of this crisis, the Israelis and the Americans and their European partners had made clear that there would be no negotiations for the return of their captives. And they ended up reaching an exchange agreement with Hamas to retrieve a number of them. So, if your military campaign is going so swimmingly, why did you renounce all the principles on which on the basis of which this war is being prosecuted? And why did you then reach an agreement with your enemy that reflected most of your enemy's conditions? And we know that because these are the same conditions that had been publicly offered in fact, before Israel's ground operations in the Gaza Strip began. Now, Israel would, of course, claim that the only reason this agreement was reached was because of its military pressure against the Palestinians. Unfortunately for them, that doesn't take away from the fact that they said they wouldn't negotiate, and they did negotiate. They said they wouldn't reach an agreement, and they did reach an agreement. They said there wouldn't be an exchange of captives, and there was an exchange of captives. Then you look at the truce, and again, you don't need to be a military analyst to understand that if an organization, all of whose senior leaders are still alive and functioning, so far as we know, it's able to fight in a coordinated manner until the very moment the truce goes into force. And then the very moment that truce goes into force, they comprehensively and simultaneously cease firing. And during the truce, they're able to collect captives from various locations and release them either on a particular day in one location, the next day in a different location, or even in multiple locations. That to me demonstrates that these organizations have managed to maintain their organizational integrity, that they've managed to maintain command and control and communications and all the rest of it. Then you look at where the fighting is actually taking place. On the first day of the ground operation, Israeli forces invaded Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Gaza Strip, those are the Palestinian towns immediately across the Israeli Gaza boundary. Well, until today, there is still fighting going on in those towns. If Israel is in control of them, why is it still launching intensive air raids on those towns? If Israel is in control of them, why are Israeli soldiers still dying or getting killed and getting wounded in those locations? So, of course, we don't know how this will end, but we can say that it's now been, I believe, 60 days. In a few days, this war will enter its third month. We've had the most intensive bombing campaign in the history of the Middle East, bearing in mind this is a region that has had more than its share of bombing campaigns. We're not talking about Scandinavia here. We're talking about the Middle East. And we're not talking about Iraq or Libya. We're talking about the Gaza Strip, which is something like 360 square kilometers. Most intensive bombing campaign in the history of the Middle East on this postage size stamp territory. Then a ground invasion by a military that is in fact a nuclear power that likes to present itself as the most advanced military and intelligence service, certainly in the region and among the top 5 of the world. Well, what we found out is it's a very efficient killing machine, as the children of Gaza can tell you, but it's a rather mediocre fighting force that not only collapsed like a house of cards on October 7th, but in terms of actual military achievements, has been able to achieve very little since then. It does have achievements to its name, razing entire neighborhoods to the ground, killing thousands upon thousands of Palestinians, I believe, was an objective of its war. That was a deliberate aim of its strategy. But it doesn't take a particularly sophisticated military to drop high explosives from fighter jets, from bombers, against a territory that doesn't have anti-aircraft defenses, against a people that are basically on the run or holed up in apartment blocks and so on.
Well, no, I mean that's very, very well said, and I think it's important to recognize that as the Israelis celebrate what they think are military achievements, because at the end of the day, I think it's also important you point out that in fact one of their objectives is to hurt and harm and kill and destroy civilians and their infrastructure.
Well,
Uh,
revenge
and
was
revenge.
the first and immediate objective. Um, more than 1,000 Israelis were killed on October 7th. So Israel has to ensure that at least 10,000 Palestinians are killed in return. It doesn't matter if they're Hamas leaders or armed fighters or civilians or infants. It's the body count that matters to them.
Yeah, and that's why on Israeli TV they literally have a count for the deaths in Gaza, and they have it all. It says terrorists. Everyone in Gaza, as they see it, is a
Well,
terrorist.
not just anyone in Gaza. I mean, I think
All
anyone,
Palestinians.
any Palestinian, effectively any Arab,
Yes.
increasingly anyone who is not only opposed to Israel, but even expresses reservations about Israeli policy is a terrorist. And this is now a term that Israeli leaders are also slinging at their closest allies. So recently, you've had statements by the prime ministers of Spain, of Belgium, of Ireland, not condemning Israel, um, expressing opposition to the manner in which it is conducting this war and expressing reservations about that. And they have been publicly accused by the Israeli prime minister of supporting terrorism. A country that can no longer distinguish between friend and foe, I think, has a very serious problem.
Well, speaking of a very serious problem, one of Israel's, I think, biggest problems this time around, and you did an excellent thread on this a couple weeks ago, it's got a propaganda problem. It has this Hasbara apparatus that it's invested so much money in for decades. And every time, whether there is a war at the moment, like we see a genocide in Gaza, or whether it's just a basic war that Israel's always carrying out in Palestine and around the region, this apparatus is always in play. And I actually just want to go ahead and quote you here. You said it used to be professional, sophisticated, intelligent, and effective. Today, it is crude and vulgar to the point of being cartoonish, more often than not outlandishly detached from reality, and aside from committed apologists, persuades nobody aside from Western mainstream media organizations, which still dutifully report its claims as serious news. And it's true. I mean, it's incredible the way Israel's been mocked around the world. I mean, there's been like different phases of propaganda throughout this war. First, it was Hamas's ISIS. There's 40 beheaded babies. There's a baby in the oven. Then there was every hospital in Gaza has a tunnel underneath it, and Shifa has, this command center. I think in one of your threads, it made me laugh really hard. You called Daniel Hagari, the Israeli army spokesperson, the tunnel meme celebrity.
Well, it's actually it wasn't intended as a joke. It's a statement of fact.
That's true too, but it at least made me giggle a little bit because it is true. And I mean, that guy is very mockable because of just how absurd. I mean, there's so many videos, right, of memes just mocking this man because of how ridiculous that propaganda was. Now we've kind of entered a new phase where everything's all Hamas are like a bunch of rapists, and there's a very like racist connotation to all of that reminds me a lot of like the sort of white supremacist trope of like every black person is a rapist going after white women. I see a lot of that playing out in almost like a PR blitz right now. But the point is that what you see when you open the internet is people are like, this is not well done. And I think it's a really good point you made that it did used to be sophisticated. It did used to be effective. And now it's mockable. And you gave a few reasons why that I think are really important to go through. Could you basically explain your thoughts on why Israeli propaganda has ceased to be as sophisticated and effective as it once was?
Well, I'll have to remember what I said. It was some time ago. But yes, I mean, at least in my view, others may disagree. If you go back to Israeli propaganda and certainly in the 60s and the 70s and so on, in my view, it was sophisticated. It was tailored to individual audiences. So when they were speaking to European social democrats, it would be all about the socialist paradise of the kibbutz. When they were speaking to evangelicals in the United States, it would be about the chosen people returning to their homeland. They had different messages for different people, and it tended to work pretty well. I think these issues can't really be completely disaggregated from developments within Israeli society. And I think one important problem that Israel is encountering in its propaganda efforts is that in over the decades, not only has the Israeli leadership become increasingly extremely far right and right wing, but Israeli society has also shifted decisively to the right. So they may recognize that it's good propaganda to talk about how much they want peace with the Arabs or peace with the Palestinians or two-state solution. You know, for decades, Israeli leaders were promoting a two-state settlement with the Palestinians, even while ensuring on the ground that it became an ever more distant prospect and impossible to implement. But they had the ability to play both sides of the fence, so to speak. Under the current circumstances, you have Israeli leaders who can't bring themselves to say they want peace with the Palestinians, who, you know, would be violating their own moral code if they made the right noises with certain foreign audiences, and are therefore incapable of, you know, spouting anything but the kind of rhetoric that works very well for them domestically, and that has undermined their message to a large extent. I think another reason also is that they became complacent. In other words, they've had it too easy for too long. When you live in a world where you no longer have to try because everyone laps up all your nonsense and even helps make it up for you, where you've successfully demonized and delegitimized not only your enemies, but also your critics, and even many of your friends who express reservations about the path you're taking. Um, you become complacent, you become lazy, you become unimaginative. And then when you have a real crisis, you can't go back to the kind of effective and professional and imaginative ways that you used to have, but you really can't do more than try to spread these crude and vulgar tropes and so on even harder, hoping they'll catch on. Another issue, of course, and as part of that, I think the Israelis became so complacent that they didn't really fully recognize and certainly didn't adequately prepare for new challenges that were emerging over the horizon. I'm talking about things like social media, you know, TikTok, and all the rest of it. And they just thought they could keep doing what they were doing because most of it is done for them by others anyway. I mean, if you look at mainstream media these days, they're still spouting nonsense that even the Israelis have stopped promoting. And I think that's an important part of the story as well.
It's almost like the media and, of course, like the entire Israeli lobbying apparatus that exists to censor or intimidate or bully. It's almost like an iron dome in an abstract way. And you actually compared it. I thought this was a really good point you made. You kind of compared it to, in a similar way, the Israeli military became complacent.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, but
Well, again, the Israeli military had it too good for too long. You know, it won this decisive victory in 1967, in which it achieved a military victory and then was able to change the political equation on the basis of its military achievements, which is a real definition, I think, of a military victory. Then in 1973, you had the shock of the joint Egyptian-Syrian offensive to recover their occupied territories, which was never supposed to happen. And then you had 1982, where for the first time we see an Israeli military being unable to achieve its objectives. And we began to see that actually, this invincible military force is really not that invincible, and was unable, for example, to conquer West Beirut through armed force against a much weaker opponent, the PLO and its Lebanese allies, which we need to remember, um, compared to similar organizations today, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen, was quite a lot weaker.
Mhm.
And nevertheless, Israel failed. I think what Israel does specialize in, and we have to give them credit for it because it does it extremely well, is self promotion and self regard. Um, then you had its failure in 2006. In 2014, in the Gaza Strip, it ran into very serious problems. And it became kind of a glorified police force, specializing in land theft and accompanying or participating with settlers on their pogroms in the West Bank, and simply assumed, that both the Palestinians and the Arab world had kind of given up on ever confronting Israel. You also had changes, I think, in Israeli society that have been significant. So, for example, you have a whole sector of Israeli society, the ultra Orthodox, that are not drafted into the military, and this has created some rancor between those who do lose a few years of their life being conscripted and those who don't. Israel has, in recent decades, in significant part on account of the Oslo agreements, become a much more prosperous country, and one where individual interests have started to count for much more than previously at the expense of collective objectives and so on. And you take all these and other factors together, particularly, when you have a stock of nuclear weapons and you have the most advanced air force and the most advanced weaponry in history because it's made available to you by the most powerful army in the history of the world, by the Americans. And it becomes easy again, as with our previous discussion. You become lazy, you become complacent, you become unimaginative, and you prepare once again for yesterday's war. And we saw that very clearly on October 7th. 1973 was a surprise attack. The Egyptians and the Syrians of 1973 did make significant efforts to conceal their preparations. But at the end of the day, you're talking, especially in the Egyptian case, about a regular army assembling a massive attack force on the west bank of the Suez Canal. It's not exactly something you can hide.
Mhm.
Um, and their best efforts at concealment and misdirection aside, the Israelis did receive very clear warnings of what was about to hit them. King Hussein of Jordan made an urgent visit to Tel Aviv to warn Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. The Israelis had a double agent, Ashraf Marwan, who was a son-in-law of Egypt's previous president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, and was a close confidant of its then president, Anwar Sadat. And he gave an urgent warning to the Israelis. There were even Israeli military intelligence analysts who recognized what was about to happen. But Israel's problem was not that it didn't have intelligence. Israel's problem was that it refused to believe the reality staring it in the face.
Mhm.
And simply, they had certain fundamental beliefs that, for example, unless and until the Egyptians received certain types of weaponry from the Soviet Union, they would not seriously consider an effort to liberate the Sinai Peninsula and so on. Well, what we've learned on October 7th is that there was a difference between 2023 and 1973. because in 2023, the Israelis had no intelligence. They did not, it's not as if they saw what was being done and ignored it. They didn't see it. Now, of course, in addition to Operation Sword of Iron, which is the operational name of the Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip, there's an equally important operation being conducted, which is known as Operation Cover Your Ass, in which every Israeli official and their brother claims to have known exactly what was going to happen, warned everyone about it, but it was someone else's fault that they didn't do anything. I don't take these issues seriously. I mean, you even had a long article in the New York Times that the Israelis actually had a copy of Hamas's master planning document for the October 7th attack, but maybe they thought it was a short
Oops.
story. I don't know. Um, you know, First of all, I very much doubt whether such a document even exists. It
Right.
was probably written by someone in the Israeli intelligence agents to give to the New York Times to show that, it wasn't us. You need to talk to it was a fault of the politicians, or it was a
Right.
fault of the army. And then you had a day or two later an article in the Jerusalem Post, which, even though operating under rules of Israeli military censorship, I thought was much more accurate, that they had no information, which is why they were unable to prepare.
Yeah, it's you could just imagine if you're involved in some sort of militant activity and you're preparing a very secret operation that nobody knows about, but you definitely wrote it all down, and
Yes.
somehow it ended up in the hands of the Israelis. I mean, it's kind of it's absurd on its face. I wanted to ask you though. I mean, one of the biggest propaganda efforts we've always seen by the Israelis is to label their critics anti-Semites. I mean, this is nothing new, that they've done this, since as far as I can remember. Um, and you have the U.S. House of Representatives set to vote on. I'm not sure if they already did yet another resolution equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and so I think that it's a good opportunity. And you did a wonderful thread on this as well. Is talking about the history of actually Zionism collaboration with anti-Semitism. And you say, and I'm quoting you, given current efforts by the Defamation League and other Israeli apologists to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, it bears recollection that the first anti-Zionists were neither Palestinians nor Arabs, but rather European Jews. And you talk about socialists and other revolutionaries insisting on the renunciation, or insisting on being anti-Zionist for many, many reasons that still make sense today. But I'm just curious if you could very briefly walk us through that. I think it's an important history
Yeah.
to remember,
Well,
especially
you
as
mentioned,
Israel
yeah,
conflates
first,
these two
just a
things.
point
Go
of
ahead.
clarification. You mentioned socialists and other revolutionaries as being among the first um, opponents of Zionism among European Jews in the late 19th century. But actually, the most energetic and the greatest, most powerful critics of or opponents of Zionism as an idea during that period were not the socialist Jews. They were the pious, Orthodox,
Mhm.
religious Jews, because, of course, according to their religious tradition, there is a return to Zion, but that return to Zion is achieved is achieved on the basis of divine intervention, and Zionism sought to substitute human agency for divine intervention, which for pious and religious Jews was blasphemy of the most unacceptable sort. So, this group of horrible anti Semites, as they would be known today, um, uh, rejected Zionism not for ideological reasons, as you would have had with the socialists or the liberals, and not just for religious reasons, but for Jewish religious reasons. And I think that's worth pointing out. Now, to get back to your question, I think it's important to point out that when the Zionist movement emerged in the late 19th century, it emerged in a European environment of nationalism and of imperialism. And the fundamental contribution of Zionism was to posit that the Jews are not a you know religious or ethnic minority or individual citizens of different states seeking equality and so on, but that they are a people and a nation in the modern political sense of the term. And in 19th century Europe, if you're a people and a nation, then you establish a state in which you have not only political supremacy, but also demographic and territorial hegemony. Now, to get more specific, it was, of course, there is a relationship between Zionism and anti Semitism, and the anti Semitism of Europe through the ages, and particularly in the 19th century, of course, helped form or helped lay the context for the Zionist movement. But the difference between the Zionist movement and other currents in European Jewish life during that period was that Zionism did not consider anti Semitism the fundamental problem.
Hmm.
The liberals did because they sought equality of citizenship. The socialists did because they sought a transformation of state and society. Um, the Orthodox and the religious did because they wanted to live freely. But Zionism considered anti-Semitism, in their words, a permanent and immutable feature of European life, and that fighting anti-Semitism was an exercise in futility. Now, if that's how you view um, uh, anti-Semitism, and if your goal is to remove the Jews from Europe and settle them outside Europe in Palestine, then of course, at one level, your natural allies are going to be anti Semites in Europe who, for different reasons, want exactly the same thing. And so there was a convergence of interest between Zionists and anti Semites who, albeit for very different reasons, wanted to see the Jews of Europe relocated from Europe to Palestine. And this goes all the way to the initial years of the Nazi regime in Germany during the 1930s, where when Hitler first took power, there was an anti Nazi boycott movement led largely by Jewish civic organizations, which was seeking to inflict maximum economic damage on Nazi Germany and hoped that this would undermine the viability of the Hitler regime. Well, who pops up and breaks that boycott and reaches an agreement with the Nazis? And again, we're talking years before the Holocaust. So this can't be justified as a desperate attempt to save Jews from impending extermination in Auschwitz, because that happened the following decade. Um, the Zionist movement in 1933 concludes an agreement called the Transfer Agreement with
Hmm.
Nazi Germany, um, which the purpose of which was something both the Zionists and the Nazis wanted, because during this stage, um, the Nazis wanted the Jews out of Germany. As long as they left, it didn't matter to the Nazis. They had not yet, begun implementing the extermination campaign of the 1940s. And according to this agreement, um, a number of German Jews um, with their capital and leaving the rest of it to be confiscated by the Nazi state would be allowed to emigrate from Nazi Germany to Palestine. And the result was, to the outrage of many Jews and many others, was that the anti-Nazi boycott collapsed. And so this is just, a few examples. I mean, Balfour, who is perhaps best known to us as the author of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, um, uh, stating that it would be British policy to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. Balfour in 1905, when he was prime minister, was the author of the Aliens Act. The Aliens Act was a piece of legislation that would have been right at home, actually, in the UK today with Cruella Braverman or Priti Patel or the others, that was designed not only to limit immigration into the United Kingdom, but specifically directed at Eastern European Jews who were fleeing intensified persecution and pogroms in Eastern Europe, who were fleeing by the millions, and to ensure that they did not enter the United Kingdom. For this, Balfour was widely denounced, particularly by British Jews, as a horrible anti-Semite, correctly, of course. But now he's a hero of the Zionist movement. So you have this whole web of relations, not only by the Zionist movement before 1948, but by the State of Israel after 1948, that was based around a convergence of interests between Zionists and anti-Semites, promoting Jewish emigration from Europe to Palestine. And just one last point, one person who played a prominent role in this relationship was Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi functionary who, when he was seized in Argentina and taken to Israel for trial in 1961, it wasn't his first time there. He had visited Palestine in 1937 as a guest of the Zionist movement.
It's so infuriating to hear that history and then to hear the way it's so warped and weaponized to smear people, destroy people's livelihoods, and justify genocide.
I just want to add one thing,
Please.
because I think there's also another incident that is insufficiently known, but that deserves our attention, which is that in 1941, in other words, Hitler had been in power for nearly a decade. He had already launched World War II. By that point, Nazi Germany had not only seized Poland and Western Europe, but had already invaded the Soviet Union, and the killing fields in the Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine and the Baltic states, were in full force. My knowledge isn't good enough to know if the concentration camps were already up and running. But anyway, by then, the extermination of Europe's Jews was already well underway. What happens the same year? The Lehi organization, which was one of the so-called revisionist Zionist movements in Palestine, led by Yitzhak Shamir, drafts a letter which was delivered to the German embassy in the Turkish capital, Ankara, proposing a formal alliance between the Zionist movement and Nazi Germany. The rationale given in that letter, and it's available, is that both of us have the same belief in the racial supremacy of our peoples. And the purpose of this alliance would be a joint effort to expel Great Britain, which then ruled Palestine as a mandatory power, to expel Great Britain from Palestine. So again, a convergence of interest for different reasons. And the reason this is significant is because some people may want to minimize this by saying, well, Lehi was not the official leadership of the Zionist movement in Palestine at the time, and so on. Well, Shamir did go on to become the prime minister of Israel, and was reelected as a prime minister of Israel on several occasions. But of course, we'd rather talk about Haj Amin al-Husseini.
Well put. Well put. I know that you are a bit short on time, so I want to be I want to be respectful of your time, but there is just like two more things I want to touch on here before you go. And one thing is very quickly, some have dismissed what the Yemenis have done as this kind of like distraction or theater that has no actual impact. But you did also do a thread on this. So I was just curious, what do you think about Yemen's role uh, in this moment, specifically with regard to the ships?
Well, so Yemen, Yemeni forces have been firing missiles and drones at shipping in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. Now, what connects the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea is Bab el-Mandab, kind of a maritime choke point that I believe is only 25 kilometers wide or so. Previously, they managed to board and seize a ship that is owned by an Israeli company. They may have damaged another ship, but some people have been looking at this and saying, well, this is hardly the Sixth Fleet seizing control of a country, and they haven't sunk any ships. So why is this so significant? And the point I make is that the Yemenis don't need to be successful in the conventional military sense of the word. In other words, the Yemenis can achieve their objectives without sinking or even damaging a single ship. Now, why is this the case? It's the case because, as I mentioned, Yemen sits astride the Bab el-Mandab. If you're going to ship things through the Suez Canal, you need to go through Bab el-Mandab, because Bab el-Mandab connects the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea, and the northern terminus of the Red Sea is the southern entrance to the Suez Canal. And the way shipping works is that these shipping companies tend to operate on fairly tight margins. And once these shipping firms and the insurance companies that make their operations possible have the confidence that these attacks are a regular feature, they're going to have to take countermeasures. One countermeasure is to jack up the insurance prices into the stratosphere, which will dissuade a lot of ships from using these waterways. Another one is to reroute the ships around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, then up the West African coast to the coast of Morocco, to then either go through the Mediterranean to get to Mediterranean ports, or further north into the Atlantic to get to European ports. And you may remember a few years ago, a commercial super container ship ran aground in the Suez Canal. Well, it disrupted global supply chains for weeks. And this had nothing to do with any conflict between anybody. And we learned at the time that something like 10 to 15% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. So the point is that the Yemenis, simply by shooting missiles, they could be aiming for a seagull for all it matters, and not at a ship, have the capacity to thoroughly disrupt global trade, bearing also in mind that a lot of oil and gas passes through Bab el-Mandab. It's kind of the equivalent of the Strait of Hormuz on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a choke point whose impact on the global economy can be quite significant. Will have a particular significance for Israel because it basically shuts off one of its main ports, which is a port of Eilat in the Red Sea. And what that means is that shipping intended for Israel will now have to go all the way around Africa through the Straits of Gibraltar and then all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean in order to reach Israel's Mediterranean ports.
It's pretty incredible. I think this is the kind of the surprise that nobody really expected to happen. And it's interesting to see how many different players are kind of peripherally moving throughout this entire horror in Gaza. The last thing I wanted to ask you about before I let you go here is, I personally, I don't know how you feel about this, but I've been a bit stunned by just how far the Biden administration and its spokespeople are willing to go to justify every single Israeli atrocity. Even I think I saw a video today of, I can't even remember his name, one of the robots who stands in front of the State Department and justifies everything in front of the press corps, essentially saying, yeah, Israel's totally doing everything it can to reduce civilian casualties after they killed like 1,000
Well, if
people
that
in
was a
one day.
statement, I wouldn't be able to tell you who it is because they all say that.
Exactly. But it's like, wow, like I guess you all think we're very stupid. But it does seem like at this point, it does feel like when you watch the administration, they really, really are willing to let the Israelis wipe out Gaza. Um, but that said, you do see a bit of a change in rhetoric, I guess. Like they trotted out Kamala Harris a few days ago to be like, Israel needs to stop killing civilians.
He now
Um,
gets to play foreign policy for
yeah,
a while.
I forgot she existed, honestly. It's like I don't know where she came from because they literally just like hide her most of the time because she doesn't poll well. But at this point, though, it does seem like the Americans do at some point start to risk their own self-interest. I mean, they are risking potential escalation across the region that would deeply impact them. And then Israel has also shown it's completely, as you said, irrational at this point. It doesn't even care about attacking its own allies. I mean, it's kind of behaving like a very bad force of imperialism in the region for the US if it continues to move. I guess my question for you is, to wrap up here, how do you see this going on for months, as Israel's saying? I mean, Israel's saying, oh, yeah, we can do this for up to a year. Does that
Well,
seem like a plausible scenario?
well, as we've learned, I mean, it was known, but it has been exposed to a much greater extent during this crisis, is how absolutely dependent Israel is on the United States, whether it's in military or political or economic terms. Israel simply would not be able to prosecute this war without the support of the United States. And that's a long way of responding to your question by saying that the end of this war is not an Israeli decision, it's an
Mm.
American decision. If you get to the point where the Israelis want to continue and the Americans want it to stop, the Americans have the leverage to make it stop, and that would involve no more than a phone call. The question becomes whether, in such circumstances, the Americans would be willing to impose consequences on the Israelis for disobeying their orders. And what we've generally seen, and actually what we've consistently seen, is that if you go back through the historical record, um, uh, with the exception perhaps of the Suez Crisis, there simply is no example of the West, certainly not since 67, imposing significant, meaningful, sustained consequences upon Israel for its actions towards the Palestinian people. In other words, the Europeans, they say they're against Israel's settlement policy. That may well be the case. I've no reason to doubt their official rhetoric. But in practice, they're the godfathers of the settlement enterprise, because an important reason that these settlements are economically viable is because they can export all their ill-begotten agricultural products to the European markets. Now, Europeans have for decades been pretending to have this very serious debate about whether products from illegal settlements are allowed into the European market under the same preferential terms as Israeli products from within the Green Line, and they finally decided they need to be separately labeled, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. I mean, can you imagine if they were having the same debate about blood diamonds from West Africa? It would be a scandal, you know. But with Israel, anything goes. So, um, getting back to the point, we don't have a record of the West imposing significant, sustained consequences upon Israel for its policies towards the Palestinians. It hasn't been the case with respect to all its annexationist measures in the occupied territories. Certainly wasn't the case in 1982 with the invasion of Lebanon, the Sabra Shatila massacres, or any of these other issues that I'm not going to bother to recount. The difference here is that this is not just about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And this is not just about Biden's embrace of Israel. You know, every time the U.S. president leaves the White House, we always hear a note of thanks from Israel that so and so is the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House. And the next president, they same thing. Next president, they say the same thing. That's certainly going to be the case with Biden. And as you've suggested, he has set such a high bar that the next US president may be the first one about who you can't claim that he was even more pro-Israeli than his predecessor. We'll have to wait and see. But getting back to the point is, it's not just about Israel's embrace of Israel or refusing to impose consequences upon Israel for its policies towards the Palestinians. There are also American regional interests at stake here. And, you know, all this talk about please send, you know, one more truck of orange juice. Gaza is an urgent need of humanitarian aid. I mean, now, you know, Samantha Power, who I think has spent most of her career trying to look earnest, is in Egypt delivering 36,000 pounds of urgently needed U.S. humanitarian aid. I mean, which is equivalent in weight to just 18 of the bombs that the U.S. has been supplying to Israel. It's not about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. It's not about the mass murder of Palestinian children. And if that was the case, it would have ended long ago. It's about the growing concern, not within the administration, within parts of the administration, within the CIA, within the Pentagon, within others, that Israel cannot continue to prosecute this war without a growing risk of regional escalation. And their main concern about this growing regional escalation has less to do with Israel than it has to do with the US. I mean, you've already seen a whole series of attacks on US military bases in Syria and Iraq. We just talked about Yemen. I don't think these people want to see the price of oil double during an election year. Then, of course, you have the very real risk of the eruption of full-scale conflict between Israel and Lebanon, and there are others. I mean, what I've said about this is that, you know, Biden doesn't care, Blinken doesn't know, and Burns is extremely concerned, you know, and I think he's joined in that by much of the top brass of the Pentagon. So the real issue here is, you know, Americans and U.S. analysts always like to talk about, you know, the different factions and the relative balances of power in foreign countries. It's often a correct approach, but that applies equally to their own country. There are rival factions in the U.S. Government. There's a power balance between them that's shifting. And the question now is, who gets the upper hand in terms of taking the lead in formulating the U.S. Response to this crisis?
I love that you said Blinken doesn't know. I think that's like the best way I've ever heard him described.
He is a bit of a clueless airhead. So.
Yeah, he really is. Well, listen, I really want to thank you for giving me so much of your time. I want to remind those who are watching, by the way, please make sure you like this episode. It does help us in the algorithm. And Mouin, before you go, can you just tell our viewers where they can find and follow your excellent work?
It's most of it is available on Jadaliya, on the website of Jadaliya.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Pleasure.